Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Happy 4th of July. And in today's upload, we're looking at Russian advances that occurred along the Belgorod-Kharkiv border, including the full capture of the village of Melove, in addition to numerous other adjacent fields coming under their control. It is an advance that puts physical pressure on a lot of nearby villages that hadn't experienced any sort of frontline engagements throughout the past 2.5 years at least, even though they've been on the border between Russia and Ukraine this entire time. And so that will be the largest emphasis of today's upload, but we're also looking at developments along the Mokryali River and Yablorivka. So let's zoom in, and I will begin by looking at the Russian advance that occurred along the southern Donetsk front. So you can see over here we have the yellow polygons indicating the recent advances from the past 24 hours. We have this small Russian extension just to the west of Friharifka, and this is mimicking an advance that already occurred. And the Russians are just continuing with the same approach of solidifying control of a populated area that runs along the western bank of the river. First, they did it with the sort of region between Friharivka and Vesele, and were able to push westwards, infiltrate rather deep behind the Ukrainian eastern flank, take over key trenches, and then that diverted Ukrainian attention away and was able to create the conditions for a two-pronged attack to squeeze the Ukrainians out of an unwanted forward position. And so that's how they squeezed the Ukrainians out of this polygon that you see I'm going over in red over here. Now, the exact same approach is being mimicked, but just one plot of fields northwards. So you can see this slight push taking over a local fortification. And as a result, you have the cutting up to a certain degree because we're still in the initial phases of this, but you can see how it is trying to sever the connection between the rear, whether we're talking about an area like Shvchenko, which in relative terms would be the rear in this case, or Mirny, and the line of contact, the gray zone that we see near the front line. So keep an eye out for these developments because the Russians are looking at just completely expelling from the Ukrainians from any buffer zone, including these open fields that are located on a relatively high elevation because they are running along a ridge that overlooks the river valley and also overlook to a certain degree the border region between Dnipro and Donetsk, along with villages that are now beginning to get embroiled in frontline conflicts, including Peribudova and Mirny. And as I've been reiterating constantly over the past couple of days, the Russians want to create the conditions for an attack that would come from the south to attack Mirny. And that would be done in unison with the attack that would approach from the north. And we're seeing that the Russians are getting very close to arriving at Mirny from that northern direction due to the recent capture of the southern chunk of Pidubny. At least it could be the entirety at this point. The Russian forces, we talked about in yesterday's video, how they succeeded in crossing over the border despite the resistance from the 37th Marine Brigade. They were able to establish a foothold along the key highway. And from there, their infantry, and this was done on foot, they were able to seep themselves into the houses and the basements in the southern parts of the village. The northern part remains a gray zone, and that's the region that's closer to some of Ukraine's nearby villages. So that's part of the logic behind why it has not been taken over yet. There's just more connectivity and allows for more resistance. But once Pidubny is solidly under Russian control, that would give them their first village to act as a forward operating base across the river, and attention could be shifted towards Mirny and the entire salient that remains on the eastern bank of the river that, according to a lot of Ukrainian sources, currently is marked as a gray zone in the sense that no one side has solid control over there. And that also implies to a certain degree that the Ukrainians are scaling back their manpower over there. But until I actually get a good indication that the, 12 square kilometers of territory that still remains in Ukrainian hands is actually getting seized by the Russians, I don't want to change my marking of the situation. And so it creates this sort of depiction on the map where you have this very bloated, outstretched salient. And that's certainly something the Russians want to correct for because they want to shift their focus entirely. They want to move their forward artillery batteries, whether they be mortars or just short-range howitzers. They want to move them to this open field region, sort of in between Bakatir and the river, because it is located on rather high elevated locations. And it's a great vantage point to fire towards the whole host of Ukrainian targets that are situated, say, 20 kilometers away, running along the border between Donetsk and Dnipro, along low-lying valleys due to the Vavcha River, and that would arrive at an area like Ivanivka, Havrilivka, even Malomikhailivka to the west, and Novopavlivka. Those are the nearby targets that the Russians really want to increase the pressure on at this point. And that can all be done once this open field and all of the nearby Ukrainian resistance is pushed back further westwards. And that's why we're going to also keep a keen eye out for the Ukrainian defensive performance and how long they're actually able to drag out fighting in these small hamlets that are acting as a buffer between the current line of contact and the Vavcha River. And a lot of that sort of based around Andrivka Klevtsova, which acts as a forward operating base for the Ukrainians at this point that feeds them into the front line and would be used to drag out the fighting to prevent the Russians from crossing over and beginning pressure directly onto Havrulivka. Because this is becoming concerning from a Ukrainian standpoint in the sense that they don't have that many obstacles that actually separate the Russians from their key bases that we've just discussed, besides the fact that you have the distance that is currently around, which could obviously change with the fall of open fields towards Andrivka Klevtsove, and then the distance could be reduced to 6 kilometers in certain locations. So then they really can only take solace in the fact that there is the river that acts as separating points. And they want to have much more insurance than just relying on a singular body of water, even if it is a bit more wide than the Mokrali River. There are some trenches that are sort of situated north and south of Havrylivka, and same thing with Novopavlivka. Ivanivka doesn't have the same sort of defensive perimeter, and so that will make it an easy target, especially because it is directly on the border. And so for now, the Ukrainians will hope that at the very least that will become a frontline battle where they can sort of contain the Russian advance and isolate it into that one populated area, as opposed to seeing broad brushed Russian advances across the entire Dnipro border and towards multiple cities that are important to them. Let's move on to Chasiv Yar. But before that, actually, I do need to look at Yablonivka. The Ukrainians have, to their credit, been able to reverse the situation over here. And I'll give a sort of blueprint for how they can continue to stabilize over here and create a sort of midterm defense strategy over here. So naturally, after the Russians conducted so many deep penetrations and took over so many populated areas and adjacent open fields, it was expected that at some point they would reach an obstacle that would really fatigue their forces to such a degree that they'd be unable to keep on advancing. And we've reached that point with Yablonivka. The Russians, they advanced along the T-0504, and throughout that endeavor, they took over a lot of areas that the Ukrainians resisted in. Again, they didn't use their highest quality units in these defensive maneuvers, the Ukrainians, but nonetheless, they were indefatigable, and a lot of the clashes around Tarasivka were eventually pushed back, and that allowed the Russians to sort of gain momentum and push through at a faster pace towards Novoolanivka. Then from there, they really fought into the southern outskirts of Yablonivka. That did require a lot of efforts. And from there, they cleared out the initial sort of western chunk of the village, along with the nearby trench network built north of the village, which has helped bog down the Russian advance because they need to go through and clear out individual dugouts. And the trenches themselves are well constructed. They're also complemented by barbed wire and minefields, which complicates armored assaults in this region. And this is one area where the Russians actually have used some of the larger armored columns over recent months. We haven't seen it a lot along many critical parts of the front line, but this is one area where they have used it to a certain degree at least. And so that helps just really drag out the fighting to a necessary degree. But with that being said, the Russian forces were also able to just seize control over a large chunk of open plots of fields. Really important areas because it gave the Russians, first of all, this large open space to utilize for armored assaults to directly enter into Alexandro, Kalinove, and Yablonivka. It also gives them a position to sort of set up forward shelling, forward artillery fire towards the Ukrainians, whether it be on the line of contact or a bit further backwards towards their rear along this connection of the two roads or Konstantinivka. So you're seeing much more intense shelling of the city itself for the first time in a while due to the recent Russian approaches towards that region. So naturally, The capture of such an expansive piece of territory did lead to fatigue within the ranks of the Russian forces, and we do have an idea of the units involved over here. We have them mapped out for you guys. We have the 102nd Motorized Rifle Regiment, so they have been working especially hard on the Yablonivka front itself, directly on the houses over there. 68th Tank Brigade is a bit further eastwards, or stationed around Ramonivka. That's their main sector of operation. 242nd Motor Rifle Regiment, also around here. The Kaskad force from the DPR, not Kaskad, but the 14th Communist Artillery Brigade, sorry, uh, part of the 51st Army Corps. You have over here the Storm Assault Detachment, so they've been involved in a lot of the forward operations, storming a lot of Ukrainian trenches and basements. 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment, and there are a couple of other similar units, one from the 3rd Army Corps as well. So there is a non-trivial amount. So like it's certainly a large garrison over here of Russian forces. So I do believe they can actually afford to conduct rotation to a certain degree. But even with all of that being considered, the Ukrainians are also conducting their own decisions, their own defensive measures, which include bringing in reinforcements, which they have done. And that's something that I raised the alarm about. And perhaps had the Ukrainians sent reinforcements earlier, before the sort of June breakthroughs that we saw and talked about so extensively, they could have prevented the Russian forces from taking over the large, expansive open fields over here that you see sort of connecting between Zoria and Tarasivka, because these regions acted as really important buffers that prevented the front line from ever reaching too close to Yablonivka. But now we're actually within Yablonivka, so the Ukrainians have adjusted to that reality and sent in the reinforcements needed to stabilize the front line, including the 36th Marine Brigade and the 157th Mechanized Brigade. And you also have, obviously, as I mentioned previously, the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, high quality units working in tandem with a lot of smaller elements like this anti-tank unit, anti-tank battalion. They've been around here for a while. One of the battalions for the separate presidential brigade is around here. 12th Azov Brigade is generally stationed in between the Yablonivka and Toretsk fronts. 44th Mechanized Brigade moved from the Luhansk front to defend over here. So yeah, we've seen a lot of diversions to help stop the bleeding, and the Ukrainians do prefer the front line sort of remain bogged down in Yablonivka because they do have a lot of experience with these sort of defensive maneuvers within mid-sized towns. Now, when you have this sort of house-house fighting in a hamlet, it becomes much more difficult to resist. But the Ukrainians can couple the strength in manpower, the strength in the trenches that are sort of located just north of the village, along with the fact that it is a bit larger in size, in order to turn it into a bastion for defense. And targets individual Russian groupings as they're approaching the village, even areas that are already under Russian control. And a part of this Ukrainian defensive conception is that they're also able to conduct localized counterattacks to improve their sort of positional situation if need be. And a perfect area for this to be done would be around Alexandro Kolinove, because you do have this sort of penetration by the Russian side into the entrance of the village, and that's still not been rectified, but the Ukrainians have made progress in pushing it back. You can see over here from July 4th, the Rubicon FPV group, they conducted strikes onto the tree lines south of the village because there were Ukrainians that were able to capture nearly 2 square kilometers of territory, pushed through the areas where they had the most space to do so, which would be the eastern chunk of the village, and were able to cross over the anti-tank ditch, make it to tree lines that had previously been seized by the Russians, and actually arrive pretty close to this local source of water. I don't really believe that it's anything too significant in size. It's just an area of low elevation. So this has created a situation where the Russians are still in control of some of the houses, but the route to enter is much more narrow. So it's difficult to defend over here. And now, putting pressure along the flanks and also directly pushing through the houses could create a situation where the Russians are fully pushed out. And again, this could all change depending on whether the Russians begin to recommit after a week or 2 week period wherein they've been less active around here. And that could change the dynamics, and the Ukrainians would sort of be back on the defensive footing. But this is a good way to improve their local positions for whenever the Russians do resume attacks, because this would prevent a lot of the enclaves from forming in the village, and there would be a more solid defense line as a result. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other sector would be Yablonivka itself, the actual head-on attacks. And over here, we have two videos of Ukrainians advancing. So again, Rubicon Center for Advanced Unmanned Technology. They played a huge role in the degradation of Ukrainian logistics in Sumy as they were feeding into Kursk. Now they've been redeployed to this region to target the Ukrainian logistics, but also just frontline operations. So they conducted strikes on, I don't know why it says Russian vehicles, it's on Ukrainian vehicles and onto tree lines wherein these Ukrainian soldiers were actually situated. And so they didn't just take over houses, they were also advancing along the southern flank to sort of accompany that advance going on throughout the two main roads. So this video is from the 3rd Special Purpose Brigade, another one of these Russian units that is deployed to this region, and they just conducted strikes on to the Ukrainian forces in these houses. So that would amount to, what is that, 0.6 square kilometers of territory, and more importantly, just a halt in the Russian advances around here. Looking at Bakhmut's Chasiv Yar front, Russian forces have talked about the capture of Pritichny and advances towards Mykolaiivka, which is just to the southwest of Chasiv Yar. None of that is verified yet. We only have one video from recent hours that gives us an indication of a slight advance. So we'll keep an eye out to see whether the Russian MOD reports end up being correct. But it sort of came out of nowhere, that Russian MOD reports. This video, though, from July 4th, shows that the Ares drone unit of the 24th Mechanized Brigade, they conducted numerous strikes onto Russian soldiers near what is referred to as Workshop Number 2. So over here, you have the Shvchenko microdistrict, which the Russians have been able to infiltrate. And it's just to the east of Mykolaiivka, which acts as the sort of a rural town just to the west of Chasiv Yar. But you also have this microdistrict, which is contested at the moment. But due to this corridor being created, it also granted the Russians the opportunity to enter into nearby locations, including this workshop facility, and there's also a nearby postal service. So we now have the Russians advancing and taking over zero point 0.5 square kilometers of territory, and it gives them further momentum to push through these houses that are near the workhouse, and then from there they can push towards this other micro district just south of Mykolaiivka, an area that serves as a right now a separation between the line of contact, including the connectivity between the Russian garrison that's pushing through Mykolaiivka and its environs, and the one that was involved in the breakthrough towards Topography. So taking over these houses over there would sort of act as a unification and give further strength to the Russian forces that are probably trying to arrive at Pritichny, regardless of whether it was captured or not. And overrunning these houses would then really create an open path through which to arrive at the trenches that are at the entrance to Konstantinivka, because you don't have any other populated areas that can be used as areas of resistance. You just have the trenches over here, which are really well built in this particular line. But in isolation, that's not going to be enough. You need several layers. And you do have this layer over here, and you have another one that sort of hugs around the northeastern entrance. But the question is whether it will be enough given the troop deployments over here, whether the Russians will just decide to circumvent some of those offenses, or whether, with everything being considered, whether these trenches will actually be effective at the end of the day when and during Russian assaults coming in from the east. So we haven't really been able to get a good taste of that yet because these trenches have been untested. This is an area that has never really been within the Russian purview up until now due to the capture of Chasiv Yar and its nearby environs. And that's why I also think that there probably is a good reason for the Russians to also focus on expanding along this northern salient, because they could potentially open up a northeastern flank through a vector that is less well defended than the direct entrance through the highway. So we'll see if the Russians do understand that reality and try to adjust their attacking locations as a result. I don't know, but that's just my sort of observation about the situation. So, zooming in over here, we also have a slight Russian advance that occurred south of Friharifka. As we've been reiterating for weeks now, the Russians are in the process of clearing out all of the ridges, all of the local hills that are northeast of Seversk. It's all parts of the plan of just sort of creating the conditions necessary to actually enter into the town or cross over the trenches that have been well built over here that span from the Donets River all the way to the southern tip of the village. So that's a part of why you have these shaping operations right now. And the Russians previously had been unable to assault these fields head on They were unable to really cope with the 81st Air Mobile Brigade's drone crews that picked them off a lot of times. So they instead opted to attack directly along the river, capturing populated areas, not entirely because Serebrenka is still contested, but it created an envelopment which now puts the Ukrainians in between in grave danger. So it's going to be a choice of just continuing to resist within the salients, which will become more and more difficult as time goes on, as we've seen with every other cauldron the Russians have formed, especially along open fields. Those ones are the most difficult to deal with because there is a less coverage for Russian or Ukrainian forces. There is concealment due to the forested patches, but actual cover and actual protection during artillery barrages or FPV strikes, that's not as feasible. So we have over here this zero point 0.9 square kilometer chunk of territory captured by the Russian side. We have the video over here that proves it. I want to click on the marker. So from July 4th, FPV strikes, they hit one armored vehicle in the video, but there were three in total that were pushing along this route that you can see with the green lines over here, sort of creating this crescent shape pushing northwestwards. So that's the route the Russians were embarking upon. They did try to cut off the salient, as you can see over here on the screen. But I don't know what happened to the two other armored vehicles that were not hit in the clip. All in all, though, as I've been reiterating, the shaping operations do continue, not at an extremely high intensity. That's certainly not the case, but you can see the direction that it's going in. And they're not really trying to assault head on from Verkhnyo Kamyanska. They do want to break through, capture Sobryanka at some point, and then advance from this northern road into Seversk. That's, I believe, what we're beginning to see develop over here, although it will take time due to the tenacity of the Ukrainian forces in Seversk and the lack of Russian resource allocation to that region. Now, when it comes to the Kharkiv front, this is a really interesting development. So we've been talking for a while now, ever since the infiltration and capture of Stroivka, we've been talking about the Russian possibility that they expand the attacks across the border, not just necessarily along the Oskil River line, but also generally across the Belgorod-Kharkiv border. So we have two concurrent attacks, and there definitely is coordination, definitely a part of the reason why the Russians attacked over here in Milove is to divert Ukrainian attention away while they were conducting the attack between Topoli and Stroivka. But I don't think that's the entire story. I think there actually is a objective that the Russians want to achieve, and they do want to seize territory over here for its own sake because they do have broader plans for the Kharkiv region. And when I'm referring to the Kharkiv region, I'm talking specifically about the open fields and smaller villages, including some chains of villages that are located east of Veliki Burluk. I think there is concerted Russian efforts, regardless of what happens in Kupiansk, which is really the original reason why the Oska River operation started. I do think that they want to shift focus to a certain level towards shaping operations to reach Veliki Burluk at some point. Veliki Burluk, though, is well defended. You can see how there is this outer perimeter protecting it, but everything up until that point actually is not that well defended, whether it be in terms of the manpower needed that is not sufficiently manning the entirety of the border or the rear villages, or just the fact that by its nature there aren't many trenches over here in the open areas between the line of contact and the Velike Borluk line. So let's zoom in on the developments. The Russian forces have finally seized control over this pocket between Stroivka and Topoli, which was held by extremely small groupings of forces from the 3rd Tank Brigade. So they were solely involved in it actually. So 19 square kilometers of territory captured, it is a significant amount. It includes a lot of forested areas and local routes, not paved or anything, just local routes that were plowed into the ground. And this gives the Russians a solid line over here and a very strong base that feeds across the river, but also feeds across the border. So now you're going to see more movement between frontline villages and the Russian border regions. And it also gives the Russians this really important impetus and momentum to attack the rest of Kamyanka and get it under their control. And Kamyanka is now pretty isolated when you think about it, because the nearest major garrison where you do have some sort of reprieve coming from, it's 8.8 kilometers away, and the connection between them is just through an entirely open route. And the local road needed is very close to the front line right now. It would be extremely dangerous to go through there, and the same thing applies to any open field. So yeah, a difficult situation for the remnants in Kamyanka, and it will become a difficult situation due to the relative isolation for all the other villages that are not running along this particular valley that are connected together by a road, which again serves as a rapid response mechanism. So if one village gets attacked, all the nearby forces, all the nearby drone crews can just immediately get into position and engage in those defensive actions. But the same thing cannot be done at a rapid pace for Odradny, for Bolohivka, or for Dvorichanska. So those villages will also be within the Russian purview and actually could be a part of a unification with the recent Russian advances in and around Milove. And by extension, you're going to look at huge chunks of open fields being taken over all at once, something that we haven't seen. It's not really that common for the Ukrainians to cede territory to that degree or not try to hold on to it to a sufficient amount or for a sufficient amount of time, I should say. But within this part of the front line, there are certain constraints that the Ukrainians don't have along the key parts of the line of contact. They have a much lower proportional amount of troop deployments, and same thing with the quality along the Kharkiv front. And that's very understandable because this area for over 2 years now has not seen intense operations, especially along the Belgorod border. And so there was no reason to have troops that were needed elsewhere, critically needed elsewhere, deployed over here languishing and not contributing. So that's the logic, but it also does have the drawdown of then giving the Russians an opportunity, inviting the opportunity to allow the Russians to cross back over. And that's why the Russians, I believe, attacked from two axes. So they attacked from the already established one, and we'll get into the order of battle. And then they also did divert forces, but also were involved in expanding the menu and expanding the sort of Russian target bank in terms of territory captured by advancing along this weak point in the Ukrainian line. And that's what they did. The Russian DRGs, they operated over here for months throughout the entirety of this year. They spotted the area where the Ukrainians were most thin in supply. And, they found this really exposed village that's right next to the border. So it's easy to reach in the first place and convert into their own base. So that's what they did. And since then, they've just been branching out and in the process captured what amounts to 25 square kilometers of territory. That is, again, really significant amounts. And if we're going to see the Russians continue over here, then we could expect to see similar amounts of square kilometer chunks of land taken at once, because to arrive at Odradny, for instance, you need to advance another 10 square kilometers to arrive at it. And same thing for all the other villages around here. But the real test of Ukraine's offensive gumption, even if they do decide to trade land and not resist over there and just try to preserve the manpower they do have, it will be a limits test to see how they defend in Obukhivka and Kolodiazny, because that's the really important line of defense that the Russians are currently trying to break through in Friharifka. So you already have undermining of the line from the south, and it could also come from the east if the Russians continue pushing along this western direction. And then from the north, you have the saline that's forming around Milove. So you can see how from three directions an envelopment is forming. It's not really crystallized yet. It's not materialized to any notable degree just yet, but it could if the Ukrainians are not able to stop these advances in their infancy. And the best time to do so would have been immediately after the advances in Destroyevka, which I did ring the alarm bells about at the time. And the second best time would have been to stop it after yesterday's attacks towards Milove, which allowed the Russians to raise their flag. And that was done by the 83rd Motorized Rifle Regiment of the 69th Division. But again, sometimes it's out of Ukraine's limitations because they can't really push back the Russian forces to a sufficient degree. Where the Russian forces, they were able to find the weak points, and they did send in a capable unit to do so. Now, it's not an elite unit by any means, but certainly they've been able to do what they need in their task by expanding control across the border. And it's a unit that did have experience because they did fight in the Kursk operation, specifically along the eastern flank of the Kursk operation. And so they have experience with the rugged geography because that's an area that's filled with these floodplains, high and low slopes, all of that, those sort of geographic anomalies. So they dealt with them already. And you have a lot of similar sort of topography over here. So we can actually get into the topography. So the Russians have control of a massive ridge that's sandwiched in between the roads from Volnovacha to Valuki and the border. So this entire area in between all these hinterlands are on pretty high elevation, with the exception of the road, obviously, that arrives at Ukraine. That's a local valley. So, that's a great forward operating point, great vantage point, great firing location for the Russians. At the same time, the Ukrainians also have absolutely massive ridges running along much of the border with Kharkiv and Belgorod. And so I'll show you guys. The Donets River is over here, so I'll use that as an outline. And then you just have this large cluster spanning from Veliki Khutori and also just south of Veliki Borluk, not including Burluk itself, and also not including the ridges, I believe, because or the valley, I would say, because that's obviously going to be located on low elevation. It does not include pre-Kolotny, so this is not completely accurate. And then it sort of dissipates around the line from Varanivka or Varivka all the way to Vovchansk. So generally, this area over here is located on a rather high elevation. It's also just completely open. There are trenches at the entrance to this large ridge area, this high elevated area, but within the ridge, you don't have that same level of defensive density, which is an issue in a situation wherein the Russians would actually be able to break through the first line. So that's a concern for sort of the long term. And it would have to be coupled with attacks around Vovchansk. And for the time being, we all know that the Ukrainians have been extremely successful in holding the line of Vovchansk. So that's a word on the sort of general elevation, but then we zoom in and see what's going on in Milove. So you do have pretty high elevation just east of Veliki Burluk. Veliki Burluk, obviously, being that it's at the crossroads of a lot of highways, it's just naturally been built along low elevation. So all these areas over here are on a valley, and then the area directly to the west of Milove is also on pretty high elevation. Area north of it is on low elevation due to the highway, and then Milova itself is actually on a bit of a depression. The border region is a bit less high up in terms of altitude. So the Russians are sort of fighting up downhill and then sort of fighting uphill based on their movements into Milova. But the elevation itself is very dynamic around here depending on the location. Both sides can use it to their advantage. So it's not necessarily about who controls the high ground. It's not as important as it would be in other locations where the positions are exclusive, and getting control over a height means denying access to the other side, the opponents, denying them access to heights. Over here, it's a bit different because the Ukrainians do still have access to numerous higher elevated areas on the rear in Kharkiv. But more generally, we have to look at the Russian deployment, because in order to get a gauge of how serious the Russians are, we need to see whether they deploy more forces besides the 83rd Motor Rifle Regiment. If they begin to deploy forces, not many, but just a couple more additional from the 69th Division or from the 44th Army Corps, then that will give us an indication that they're looking at really deep exploitations of the Ukrainian line. When we look over here at the Oskil River line, a lot of these newer forces created in 2023 or 24 are deployed. You have the 344th, the 350th, the 121st. Over here, you have the 1844th, 45th, or 55th rather, 46th, and over here, 43rd Motor Rifle Regiments. All of them new units, less experienced, less well equipped. All of those factors have to be taken into account. But in terms of raw manpower, that does give the Russians a large pool from which to select forces to attack. And it's being done with the sort of guidance of the 25th Brigade and 27th Brigade that are also operating around here, and have sort of shifted their focus away from Kupiansk to cross over the river, where there are more chances of achieving advances. The Ukrainians likewise have redirected forces. First, they redirected the 15th National Guard Brigade from the Selidova area at the time. That's where it was very prominent, and we talked about it a lot at the time. Also, the 154th Mechanized Brigade, one of those new NATO series units created, Comanche drone units, and let's see what other notable elements. One of the most battle-hardened units from recent times is the 151st Mechanized Brigade. They fought around Friharifka and the Pokrovsk front, but now they're engaged in the high-intensity clashes over here. 5th National Guard Operations Brigade. They are previously have been of the Yablonivka front, that entire region that the Russians recently were able to advance through significantly, but it's been redeployed to defend in Kharkiv and along the Oskil line. And you have a couple of other units. You have the
Stugna Special Group Unit. It's a part of the Timur Unit as a whole, which is this special operations unit in the GUR. So they're conducting operations around here along with the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Siberian Battalion. So that's just a rundown of the deployments of forces. And to zoom in once again on the extent of the advances, you have the one west of Topoli amounting to 5.7 kilometers westwards. And then from Milove, you have the Russian advance amounting to, what is this, 4.5 kilometers westwards. And as I said before, 25 square kilometers. Milove itself, fully under Russian control. Now they have a sort of way to feed into Chikhunivka and to the highway that actually leads to Vilhuvatka to cross over the trench line that is so prominent around here. You also have a lot of dense forestry that's fallen into Russian hands, like these over here, which will give their DRGs a sort of room where they're not exposed to Ukrainian drone crews. And the next, I suppose, objective would be to arrive at the other populated areas so they could establish forward operating bases like Ambarny and Khatne. So we will keep an eye out for that. We'll also keep an eye out for a shift southwards to sort of put pressure onto the Kolydzyazny line, and that will prove crucial in future endeavors for the Russians over here. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.